This is the Canadian flag, although did you know that throughout Canada's history it was represented by another flag? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in today's video. What happened to the old Canadian flag? As we all know, this is the modern Canadian flag with its famous maple leaf bang in the center. The oldest flag that we know of that was used in Canada before was in 1479, when the English flag of St. George was raised by John Cabot over Newfoundland. Newfoundland, as it's pronounced. Sometime later, in 1534, the French would also have missions of exploration in Canada, and the fleur-de-lis, the flag of the French king, would be raised by Jacques Cartier on his missions of exploration in the Quebec area. As a result of this, early modern Canadian history would be divided into French and British spheres of influence, with the French remaining an important part of Canada's cultural makeup, something that will be important later on when the question of flags is raised again. Now from 1621, we know that the Union flag, representing the union of the kingdoms of England and Scotland, was also being used in the British parts of Canada. And when they defeated the French and claimed all of Canada as their own, this became the official flag of the colony. That would be until 1867, with the Act of Canadian Confederation, when 4 provinces would come together to form what is now known as Canada, which more provinces have been added to since then. In 1870, the Governor-General of Canada would get its own flag, which was simply the Union flag with the crests of the 4 Canadian provinces added into a coat of arms that we see here, those provinces being Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Now, as time went on, this red flag, which became known as the Canadian Red Ensign, was based on the governor's shield that we find, but in the form of a civilian or a civil ensign. The red ensign that we also, for example, saw in the early versions of New Zealand's flag as well. This was basically a flag that was used particularly on ships to show where they had come from, to show that they had not come from another part of the British Empire with the British flag, but rather to have this ensign with its own symbol to show that it was, yes, part of the British Empire, but from a specific part of it. This design also changed throughout history. For example, in 1922, to accommodate new provinces joining the Canadian Confederation, or rather being created, we then see that the crest is also updated to follow suit. By the time of the Second World War then, this red ensign was being seen as a de facto official flag of Canada, even though the official flag was still the Union flag of the United Kingdom and the British Empire at large. However, by the end of the Second World War, the need for its own official flag became more pressing, and around 2,409 different designs were sent in to the government when they opened up a commission to have the flag changed. From this, it was found that the vast majority of the designs had featured the colors of red and white and had a maple leaf on it, bearing in mind, of course, that the maple leaf was also found on the red ensign as part of the crest. It was said that the national flag of Canada should be the Canadian Red Ensign, with a maple leaf in autumn gold colors in a bordered background of white. However, not everyone was happy with this change, particularly the Assemblée nationale du Québec, part of the French-speaking region of Canada, which blocked the motion to have this flag accepted. This was because, as the descendants of the French who had settled in Canada, they felt no affiliation with the official symbols of the United Kingdom, which, of course, had been the ones imposed on them following the British victory in the 7 Years' War, particularly in the Canada area. Fearing that this would stoke inter-ethnic conflict in Canada, the Prime Minister at this time decided not to go forward with the making of an official flag in Canada, and so the situation with the Red Ensign being an unofficial flag continued for several more decades. That was until 1964. Following several years of a Liberal minority government, the governor at the time, Lester Pearson, decided to have another crack. Little did he know that this would spark the Great Canadian Flag debate of 1964. Lester Pearson was thus the Liberal Prime Minister who wished to create a new and official flag for Canada, which, of course, it did not yet have. He said that he wished to establish officially, as the flag of Canada, a flag embodying the emblem proclaimed by His Majesty King George V on November 21, 1921, that being 3 maple leaves conjoined on one stem, in the colors red, and white. Then designated for Canada, the red leaves occupying a field of white between vertical sections of blue on the edges of the flag. Now, part of Lester Pearson's desire to have an official flag for Canada came from the fact that he had been one of the major peace brokers in the 1957 Suez Canal crisis, when British and French paratroopers, aided by Israeli forces, had attacked Egypt in an attempt to stop the nationalization of the Suez Canal, which before had been in British and French hands. As a result of the peacekeeping process, Lester Pearson had, involved with the UN, sent a peacekeeping force consisting of Canadian troops. However, the Egyptian President Nasser had actually objected to the presence of Canadian peacekeepers because the symbol found in the red ensign being used by the troops was the same as the flag of the United Kingdom, and therefore he felt they could not truly be partial, or rather impartial, to the demands of the British and truly a neutral force. This had set him on a mission to change the flag of Canada to one that was unmistakably Canadian, something he sought to do in 1964 when he pushed for a change to be made and proposals to be brought forward by a group of 15 different politicians from various political factions, including from his own Liberal Party, the Conservatives, and indeed the Francophone parties as well, several of which were actually conservative and liberal in various measures. The flag that he described and came up with was this one, that with the 3 maple leaves that had already been on the flag since 1921, and King Edward's pennant, as it was known, on a field of white with 2 blue bands to the sides. This became known as Pearson's pennant, but it was not particularly popular. Particularly, the leader of the opposition, John Diefenbaker, the leader of the Progressive Liberal Party of Canada, who had been in power several years earlier, was a prominent opponent of the idea to change the Canadian flag at all, and instead wished rather to keep the red ensign with its links to the United Kingdom and the old British Empire. There were several important factors to keep in mind when designing a new Canadian flag in order to keep everyone happy. Part of Canadian society, particularly those descended from the English and more broadly the British that had come over in the colonial period, were in favor of keeping the British symbols and, indeed, in favor of keeping the red ensign as it was. More liberal Canadians, whether of French background or indeed of British background, who did not wish to retain these symbols, didn't want to have the Union flag on any part of the Canadian flag, and so voted instead to get rid of it entirely. There was also, of course, the sizable minority of French Canadians who would wish for some kind of French flag. French symbols to be found on the design, and indeed of all the public designs that were sent in, the fleur-de-lis proved to be the most popular of these more francophone-aligned symbols to be found on the designs. The government groups that were in charge of making these new flag designs came up with these 2 designs, both of which featured the colors of red and white and the maple leaf, one of them also containing the Union flag and a more French style flag with 3 fleur-de-lis on a blue background. However, these still seemed unsatisfactory, and it would actually be quite by coincidence that the head of the committee that had to choose the new flag to be put forward to the House of Commons for selection, John Matheson, would actually come from him going for dinner with his friend George Stanley, a prominent Canadian historian in Ontario. While they were walking, they would go past the Royal Military Academy of Canada, and there they would stand and look at the flag fluttering in the wind, and it was at this point that George Stanley said that he believed the new flag of Canada should be based on this design, but instead of the logo, the crest of the military institution in the center, there should be a maple leaf. And that, of course, is how we find his design that he sent in for the Canadian flag that was then approved by Matheson and put to a vote of the 15 government officials that were in this group to select the flags, and that was eventually put forward to the House of Commons. It took 6 months and 308 speeches for this flag to finally get through the House of Commons, but in the end it was successful. Writing to his friend George Stanley, Matheson would say, "Your proposed flag has just now been approved by the Commons. 163 to 78. Congratulations, I believe it is an excellent flag that will serve Canada well." And indeed, this then became the official national flag of Canada that we still see and recognize today. It must be said, though, that the Union flag, as a compromise to the Conservatives that had not wanted a new or official flag, is still often used in official capacity beside the flag of the maple leaf on official government buildings and on other occasions. The red ensign is still sometimes seen in some places in Canada, particularly being used by Anglo-Conservatives and veterans of the armed forces. That said, the the red ensign can still be seen as the base for several of the provincial flags of Canada, with the provincial crest and the St. George's Cross then being used in place of the crest of all of the Canadian provinces as it was found on the Canadian red ensign. But for now, that is all I have to talk about the Canadian flag and the Canadian red ensign. Until next time, I have been the last historian, and this has been the Canadian flag history.